The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to Paranormal Concept right here on Parasearch UK Radio with your host, Paul Rook.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a new wonderful edition of the Paranormal Concept Show. I'm your host, Paul Rook, and on tonight's show, Kerry Greenaway is joining us as always. Hello, Kerry.
Hello, you alright?
Yeah, not too bad. How have you been?
I'm absolutely fine, thanks.
Cool. Have you been up to anything paranormal this week?
I'm reading Science Psychology. I'm reading that book, whatever it's called. I always get the name wrong. Which is about Dr. Alex Tannis, written by Cal Cooper. Oh, part of it is written by Cal Cooper. Fascinating, really interesting. So I've read that. I was reading some articles. Oh, see, I'm into my psychology at the moment. So I was reading some articles earlier on belief systems and things like that. So that was interesting. And I've just watched a documentary. It's an old documentary. It's not a new one, by Dr. Richard Dawkins. And he's very scientific. He is none of this with the spiritual side at all. And although I don't always agree with his opinion, I do. It is thoroughly interesting. It's a very interesting documentary, but it's coming from a very, very strong scientific mind. Is all I would say. But you know, there doesn't seem to be a lot of. He says he's open-minded, but he wants the proof, and he won't get the answers he wanted. But it was really, really interesting. Really, really interesting. So yeah, I've actually been diving back into it. Sometimes
that sort of makes you think out of the box as well.
Yeah, it makes you think different thought patterns about things that you've read or learned, and you think, well, yeah, that's relevant, or no, it's not. It's about looking at somebody's different perspective, and although I don't agree with him in his approach, I think he's too close-minded, too scientific, particularly when you're looking at the world we look at, because there are a lot of things that are unproven yet, and a lot of theories coming through that scientists are sort of going, well, hang on a minute, there's basis here for further exploration. And I do think it needs the both sides of things. I think you can look at it from a scientific perspective, but be open-minded and don't just sort of go, oh, it's all woo-woo. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's all
I think with the science,
you know.
Yeah,
sorry.
Exactly. I think once the science has been like, yeah, okay, we know what that is, we don't need to go there again. And then it just takes one person just to change the whole view, and then they go, well, hang on a minute, he's got a point.
Yeah, but I think it's the same in whatever field you're in. I think with scientists, you're going to get open-minded scientists. You're going to get very fixed position scientists. You're going to get a range in between those two extremes, in exactly the same as you do in any field, you know.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when I was reading about him, because he wasn't somebody I'd come across before. When I started reading about him, he actually does come across quite militant. It has to be recreatable. It has to have, you know, like parameters and you know, restrictions and protocols in place for the experiment.
Yeah.
It's too rigid for the field that he's trying to work in. But then also I do kind of see their point. That's the problem I have. I kind of do see their point. But I also believe that we work with energy, vibration and frequency, and we haven't quite worked that equation out in regards to how that fits with our psyche and a different frequency. What the word can I use for it? Or dimension or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? But,
yeah,
you know, this is where I end up when I'm researching, and this is a bit of a thing I have because I work very spiritually, so I have a very set belief system in the spiritual side, but I also look at things from a different perspective and can see that perspective too. So I do find myself swaying between the two at times, you know. It's very confusing, everybody, is all I can say.
I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. I can only imagine what goes on in your head. I wouldn't want to be there.
That's just a few things I've been looking at this week. It's been a very big... I've been down quite a deep rabbit hole this week in one way or another. So, yeah, it's fascinating, though. Absolutely fascinating. I love a rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Yeah, you do. I know you do. Yeah. It turns out to be more of a termite mound than a rabbit hole.
All right, we'll go with termites.
Yeah, that's so much better. Anyway,
yeah, right.
Getting on to the subject that we're going to be talking about tonight. So last week we spoke about vanishing bodies that were going missing. So I thought this week we'd talk about the subject from a different angle, and we'd go with body snatching. More particularly the infamous snatchers, Burke and Hare.
They are the most infamous ones, aren't they? Of all the, they are naughty.
Yeah, and you didn't know too much about them until this week.
No. To be fair, it was like I just kind of saw them in graveyards digging up bodies and like shipping them off to the anatomy classes and get paid for it, and that kind of was only what I thought about that. Bearing in mind, I haven't seen the film because there's been a film recently, hasn't there?
There has, and I have seen it, but for the life of me, I can't remember what went on. It's just one of those films I probably watched and fell asleep halfway through.
That good, eh?
Well, now I'm getting old, you see, and films do sometimes. It's one of those films that I would probably have to watch about 8 times and then still have no clue what happened at the end of it.
And to be fair, it's probably one of those films that I would love and be going, oh my God, this is really great. And he's going like, what the hell?
Yeah, absolutely.
Our film tastes are very different, aren't they? But no, they are a fascinating pair. This particular thing is, or this subject actually, is actually quite fascinating. I found it very fascinating looking at this.
Absolutely, I did. I really found it interesting. So yeah, I mean, in the course of the research, apparently, I read that robbing a grave could take less than an hour, just using a wooden spade, which made less noise, so the earth was moved from the top end of the coffin, and then using a crowbar to lift the coffin lid.
Oh, I see.
And then when the body was open, so rather than literally just digging the whole coffin out, they'd just dig down to the head end, then they would open the coffin at that end and just drag the body out, and then stripped it naked, and then the soil was returned over the grave to basically cover up what they've just done.
It's quicker than I anticipated. When like I just kind of envisaged, I suppose, them toiling all night to dig a grave up. Do you know what I mean? Whereas they didn't. It took them less than an hour. I kind of just thought it was a longer process than just an hour.
Well, because obviously they know they're going to get caught and persecuted, if they get caught, so they're going to want to do it really quick. So they're going to want to just go in and out as quick as possible.
Yeah, well,
so
that makes sense, but I just didn't think it was possible. In all honesty, because I suppose I was imagining a 6-foot grave that they're digging up, and I suppose in reality people probably weren't buried 6 foot under. That's probably wherever they could fit them. Mind you, that's 7 years today, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And again, in the course of the research, I mean, I'd always known them as body snatchers.
Yeah.
But I think you used the term resurrectionists.
Yeah.
Which I've never heard of before. And then sack 'em up men.
Yeah, see, when we was talking about this, what was it, last week we were talking about this, or after Friday?
Yeah.
Might have been after Friday's show we were chatting. And we
Yeah.
were just talking about, we're doing Burke and Hare, and the conversation's going on. And I went, oh yeah, the resurrectionists, and Paul was like, and then we googled it and we found Saccamups. Saccamups.
Yeah. I know.
We were like, what? Just thought they were just body snatchers. I didn't think anything more of it, really. But it's amazing what you find out, isn't it?
It is. I think it's just a fascinating world. I mean, because I've got the medical background as well, I'm always interested in the human body. And I think it's just such an amazing piece of machinery. It's just fantastic. And you know what? I even watch all these autopsy programs on the TV late at night.
You might know the answer to this question then, right? So they want the fresher the better, I would imagine.
Yep.
Corpse. Rigor mortis, is that, once you've got rigor mortis, is that it? Or does then it go again? So you only get rigor mortis for a set time?
Rigor mortis does set in shortly after death, but it doesn't. The body doesn't stay rigid.
Oh, I see. So when they're dragging the body out of the coffin, the chances are the rigor mortis would have passed, so they're not like stiff as a board.
No, it would have passed.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Yeah, that was one of the questions.
And then obviously, and then they take the bodies so that they can be taken to colleges and things like that, where they dissect the bodies, obviously for the medical profession, to cut up and stuff. Yeah.
Well, they had to practice on something, I suppose.
Absolutely, and now you get to see them on the TV doing it, and I think it's absolutely fascinating.
It is fascinating, but I think what you have to understand is, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I thought you'd disappeared. I think what you have to understand is the medical knowledge at that time. It was going through an explosion, wasn't it? And a lot of the reason, because they had a chance to get their hands on real anatomy, like real cadavers, and they were learning so much by having access to this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it wasn't anything to do with Burke and Hare, but a couple of years ago, I was asked to go and do a ghost investigation with the Heart Radio team.
That's right. Yeah.
Halloween night, and I'd done a bit of research beforehand on the actual building that they use, and it used to belong to a surgeon, and he would actually buy cadavers and have them delivered to the building so that he could actually dissect them and stuff at home as practice. So it's sort of, it just shows how common it was. As more so in London, I think, because obviously you had more surgeons and stuff. Obviously, it was built up more. But it was. I think it was quite a common practice that they would do this. I think
this is another one where you have to look at the whole picture of the society set up. The culture and the lifestyle and stuff like that. I think it's another one of those times where you have to look at it in those terms and put yourself in context to what you're looking at with this. And, the extreme poverty and a need, the poverty people will exploit that because that's desperation. It comes from desperation of fear and survival, basically. So it maybe pushes you to do things you wouldn't do in this day and age, because we haven't got that level of poverty, I suppose. But,
absolutely.
We always want more, don't we, than we've got.
Well, that's it. And in the beginning of the 1800s, those that could afford it would pay for what they call a mort safe. Basically, I mean, if you go to an old cemetery now, you'll see some of the graves with a metal cage over it. Mm-hmm. It was basically an iron cage built over the grave, or stone vaults, to stop the grave robbers.
Yeah, but those people, you're looking at people that are affluent that can afford this. If you're a pauper, you haven't got it. Do you know what I mean?
No. Yeah.
So, But I have to say, how many times have people seen one of those mort things that you were saying about?
Mort safe.
The mort safe, that's right, the cage thing. And actually said, it's a mythology has grown up around it. Actually sort of to do with things like vampires and witches and stuff like that, when actually it's nothing to do with that. It was just to stop body snatching.
Exactly. It's quite amusing. I mean, especially for people that don't actually know what they are, they just sort of jump to conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite. It shows. It just goes to show, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
But
so, do you want
you have got this huge social differences, haven't you, from people that can afford to protect their loved ones in death by posting watches and putting these mort safes over and all the other things, and then you've got the extreme poverty where they can't even afford a funeral, so they're going to a pauper's grave. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know that some cemeteries actually had it's almost like guard towers over them as well.
I did not know that. Before this, I did not know that.
Yeah,
because it was that prolific.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know of any, but apparently it was quite a common practice.
Yeah, that's what surprised me, was when I was starting to read about it. I was like, okay, first of all, did the medical industry, in my head, was like, how many corpses do they need? Do you know what I mean? Like, for it to become an industry, almost. And then when I started looking at it, I was thinking, oh, God, you know what I mean? It's like, this became quite a crime. It became quite in society, it was like a really bad thing. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Which obviously it is if it's, a relative and body goes missing. I mean, it's quite traumatic, isn't it? And
it's...
but all of this actually was the problem was, before we had loads of people dying by hanging or, torture or stuff like that. So that they had the corpses from that. But then they changed the law.
Yep, that's it. It was the Judgment of Death Act in 1823, and that basically saw the number of crimes punishable by death in Britain to drop dramatically.
Exactly.
So not many people were killed or executed for crimes. So, that led to a shortage of bodies available, which then...
if you're poor... But, if there's an opening to make money, people will take it, right? It's always been the same. Always been the same. That's how society works and how poor people get by, walking on sort of like the sharp edge of the knife, as it were. But, it kind of creates... It's a bit like the Witchfinder General, though, isn't it? All of a sudden, there became a gap in the market for a witchfinder, and they took it and ran with it. It's the same as these guys. They saw a gap in the market and kind of went for it.
Yeah, that's exactly what they done. And, they... But then the medical field was lapping it up. Although, it was illegal, it led to quite a few advances.
Well,
and I do actually think as well, this sort of stemmed... Well, I started off the legend of Frankenstein.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know about that bit, but I kind of can understand. I can kind of understand how this situation occurred. I'm not saying it's right. Yeah. I'm just saying I can understand how it occurred. But anyway, right. We're talking generally about grave robbing.
Oh,
at the moment, we're not focusing on Burke and Hare particularly. That's a different story completely. But in general, this was actually quite a big problem.
Yep.
So should we have a look at Burke and Hare?
Okay, go for it. I'll let you start. And then I'll find you as far in the research, and then I'll join you.
Oh, okay.
Because I know you like to jump
I like to jump ahead, apparently. I've got a bit of an issue with jumping ahead and jumping around the research. I'm being told off on air. Anyway, let's see if we can keep up with this one. Now, Burke and Hare, basically, it was between 1827 and 1828, so it's only a year, and this was in Edinburgh, right? But they both were Irish, and they originated from Ulster, so they were Northern Ireland. But they moved to Scotland to work on the Union Canal, because that was a big thing. The navvies, was it they were called, came over, and they were good at roads, and they were good at building stuff, right? So they came over. But now Burke was married and had 2 children in Ireland, but he just didn't really give a shit about that and came to Edinburgh, right?
I think it's more the fact that they were poor, they needed money, and they obviously went where the work was. A lot of people did that back then.
Well, this is true. Different times and styles, I suppose. Now, the pair met, Burke and Hare met, and Burke moved in with his mistress, Helen. I'm not going to go into further details. We're going to call her Helen because it gets a little confusing. And they lived in Tanner's Close in Westport area of Edinburgh. Now, Hare, he lived on the same street and was running a boarding house with Margaret. So they're both shacked up at this point. And she was known as Margaret Hare as well, even though they weren't actually legally married. People did that back then, didn't they?
They did.
They just took on a name without actually making it
legal. I think it's... Yeah, I think probably because of the money involved, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they live in sin, but they just see it as married, don't they?
Yeah, I suppose, without making it official.
Yeah.
But they did that a lot back in them days anyway. Cool. Now, in the December of 1827, excuse my children, inappropriate laughter moment there, one of Hare's tenants, an army pensioner by the name of O'Donnell, died, right, whilst in their boarding house. So they were a bit like, oh my God, he owes us money and he's died, and this is going to cause us money because we're going to have to call people to get rid of him and stuff. So what they thought about this, and they decided to go to the medical school at Edinburgh University, right? And they were pointed in the direction of a Professor Robert Knox, who was an anatomy lecturer. Now Knox paid them £7.10 for the body.
Cool.
They made a bit of a profit there, right? Because he only owed £4.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So you can imagine they're thinking, "Hello, now this is like sweet
black market stuff." Yeah.
Right? This is cool, right? So, and it was really easy as well. They said it was really, well, they didn't say, but it was actually really easy. Now, what they tended to do was, because they've got the boarding house, the lodging house, they would actually attract people to stay that were ill or poor, easily missable people.
Yep.
And then they would sort of help the process of death.
So it's almost literally a house for the old and infirm.
Kind of, but they kind of helped them along.
Yeah.
I don't think it was very big. I think it was only a 2 or 3 bed type house. It's like a lodging house. Pay for a room and that. Don't get many of them these days, I don't think. So they got another tenant who was a bit poorly, and this is Joseph, and it was taking a bit long to die, so they helped him. They plied him with whiskey and then suffocated him. And then they kind of sold the body.
Was this to the same... I wonder if it's to the same Robert Knox as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's the whole time. It goes through Robert.
Okay.
Dr. Knox is up for a body, and he doesn't mind what sort of body either. Really, he's we'll have an old
he
one,
just doesn't ask any questions.
He just takes what's given. But the reason they did it that way is because it left the body unmarked, so it looked natural. And bearing in mind, medical science at that time weren't looking at forensics and stuff. They're just hey, it's a dead body, let's cut it up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're not looking. They're just assuming that it's died naturally. And the bloke was ill as well. So if they had found something and they were, well, he died because he had consumption, or he died because he had tuberculosis, because you got to think back in the day of what diseases were around then. So that method actually became known as Burking.
I know that. Yeah, I see that, and I've never heard of that term either.
I'd not heard of that. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder how that kind of like spreads. What is there a under society of grave robbers? Like is it down in London? They go, the guys in Edinburgh, they use this method. It's called Burking.
Yeah. I'm sure someone. Well, no, I mean, they must have done it because the surgeon down in London, he was taking dead bodies off of grave robbers. So it must have spread. Whether these were the first ones to do that, I don't know. I probably doubt that, to be fair.
Or they're the most notorious because they actually murdered people to supply.
Yeah.
They got caught for it.
Yeah.
Oh, one of them did. We'll come to that in a bit, everybody. So anyway, the ill people weren't really working out for them. So basically what they decided to do, they started to pick on people, like poor people, like, not easily missed or recognised. And they reckon that they murdered about 16 people.
Okay.
In this manner. Now, there was a situation with a local prostitute called Jeanette Brown. Apparently, her and her friend Mary was invited to stay by Burke, but she had gone home earlier in the evening. Now, she returned to find that her friend was missing, and that Burke had stepped out, right? So she was sort of like waited for her friend to return, but Mary was like dead in the next room. And she was already gone, mate. So this Janet was lucky she left and didn't come back, and that they were out when she came back. So she was quite lucky. Oh, there are some horrific stories of what they're supposed to have done.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you said, they've murdered roughly 16 people, and they're getting between £7 and £10 for each body. Mm-hmm. So that's still a lot of money, isn't it? I mean, even if it's, say for example, it's £10 for each body, that's £160. In those days, that's almost like years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very attractive when you've been poor, then all of a sudden you've got money. That's very attractive. And considering how easy it is, and they're obviously not very good with conscience, there obviously doesn't worry them that they've killed people for this.
No.
So I suppose the mental gymnastics would be that they're not no loss to society kind of people.
Yeah.
I suppose would be the self-justification for murdering somebody for this cause. But then there's a whole lot of other side of it, of greed and need and, having something you haven't is a lot more attractive. So I kind of think you really do have to remember what it was like back in those days and the conditions people were living in. And money was a lot bigger pull back then. So, now they became quite greedy. An elderly grandmother was killed with painkillers, and Hare murdered her young grandson by breaking the boy's back. So there are horrific stories surrounding Burke and Hare. So it could be the notoriety, it could be stories that people have made up post-event to make them seem worse than they are.
Yeah.
And, there's probably a lot of folklore and mythology has grown up around the story and embellishment and stuff like that. So I would think there's probably a fair amount of that.
Absolutely. It was. I mean, with the greed, they started getting a bit careless with what they were doing, so they were bound to get caught eventually. Anyway.
Well, they certainly were, because some of the students started to recognise some of the corpses that were being brought to them. Namely some of the prostitutes. I would just like to say,
I can't imagine why.
kind of says a lot about the medical student contingency, doesn't it?
That's because all the students were there, sitting with their little anoraks in their glasses, pens, and yeah.
I'm sure I was with her last Friday. Joshua, isn't that who I was with last Friday? You know what I mean? So they started to recognise some of the corpses that came in. And, I think things started to rumours started to spread as well at this sort of time about how they were acquiring their corpses, considering you can imagine there's a super fresh. Oh, this sounds horrible. The corpses Burke and Hare were supplied were very fresh, whereas if you dug them up out of a grave, it's not quite so clean. They would be I wouldn't have said they were that clean.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So I think rumours were starting to be spread around this. At this point, anyway, I'm not laughing. Inappropriate laughter going on over here, I tell you. So yeah, that's where I think. Anyway, what do you think?
No, I think I agree with you. To be fair, yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I mean, I have to say, at one point, Burke and Hare brought in a handicapped children's entertainer. So this is kind of like quite I would say probably quite well known on the streets kind of guy.
Yeah.
And he actually had a nickname. He was known in the city as Daft Jamie. Right? Now, they murdered him and gave him to Knox. And Knox obviously denied the identity of this corpse, but quickly removed his head and feet. So...
yeah, so then...
Put that one to rest. We don't need that. We don't need those bits. Get rid.
Yeah, that's it. It's like, oops, sorry, they're just thrown out the window.
So I have to say, I think Knox was probably not that stupid. I think he probably kind of had a fair idea, but kind of turned a blind eye. He didn't care where the corpses came from. He just wanted corpses, if that makes sense. That's where I think Knox was. He was like, well, they're just providing me with a service, you know.
Yeah.
But there was an argument between Burke and Hare. Now, Burke's suspicion that Hare and Margaret were cutting himself and Helen out of the deals with Knox. So all of a sudden, between Burke and Hare, we've got a money issue. Greed is starting to come into this play. And it's starting to turn on each other. So one thinks the other's screwing them over, and it becomes a bit messy. So Burke and Helen then decided to do their own lodging house. So they kind of split. They were like, right, fine, well, you go your way, we'll go ours. We'll open our own lodging house. You can sort of see how it's going. God, Knox could have ended up with a plethora of corpses.
He could, couldn't he?
If this pair had kind of gone under that one. Now
2 surgery courses a day.
Could you imagine it? Oh, just as well they got stopped. Now, basically, the last victim, Marjorie Campbell Doherty, was invited to stay with Burke and Helen on the pretense that she was a distant relation of Burke's mother, right? So another couple called James and Anne Gray were invited to stay temporarily at Hare's boarding house so they could murder Marjorie. So although there's like a fallout, they are still kind of working together.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, on the return to Burke's lodgings the following day, the Greys were told that Marjorie had been asked to leave because she'd been a bit flirty with old Burke, right? Very offended old Burke was on that one. But
I can imagine, total disgrace that.
I can imagine how that went down. Anyway, so, that was their excuse. Now, the couple weren't allowed to go into the spare room, which is where they'd left their belongings. And that's when they started to get suspicious. Then, when they're left alone, they discovered Marjorie's dead body that was actually hidden under the bed.
Well, I suppose that's the best place to hide them, I suppose.
They
it's either that or
They offered her a bribe. Yeah, they did offer her a bribe of £10 a week if she would keep it to themselves. Do you know what I mean? But the Greys refused and actually reported the murder to the police.
Yeah, I bet that done their star rating a load of good, didn't it?
Could you imagine it on TripAdvisor today?
Yeah, that's it. Dust on the picture frames, dead bodies under the bed.
The problem is, you've also got to remember, the policing back in those days was not very advanced at all. So basically, if they turned up and there was a dead body, bang to rights, no body, oh well, see you later. Haven't found anything. Yeah. You know what I mean? That there isn't the response that there would be in this day and age. So the police arrived, and by the time the police got there, well, Mr. Dr. Knox had already got the body and was doing his thing. So they'd already got rid of the body. So that, like, the police turned up and they're like, oh, no body. Okay, well, like, sorry to disturb you, sir. And off they went again. Anyway, they came back and they did arrest them. But they all gave conflicting accounts of what had happened. So they all blamed each other, basically. And it all got like, oh, it's his fault. No, it's his fault.
Yeah.
So, but basically, the investigation, they did investigate it. I've taken the mickey out of it, but they weren't as bad as that. They did investigate it. And it did lead them to Knox himself. And James Gray actually identified the body of Marjorie, because it was still at the thing. He hadn't quite got to cutting it up.
On the slab.
Yeah, basically. So anyway, then other thing, and this is where it begins to roll and other people start coming forward, because then Janet Brown, who was the one that got away with it, as it were, was talking about her friend Mary, and then they sort of started to link all the evidence together, and this is sort of where it all came out. Now, the trial began on Christmas Eve in 1828, and the following day, Burke and Helen were both charged with Marjorie Docherty's murder, sorry, not two people, it's one person. Burke was also charged with the murder of Mary Patterson and James Wilson. Okay? Now, while Helen was complicit in Marjorie's murder, it was not proven under Scottish law, so she was set free. So it was just Burke that was sentenced to death by hanging.
Okay.
It's very confusing with the four of them, I tell you.
It is a bit, isn't it?
Honestly, I was reading this going, I had to write down like who was who and where they were, and I had to do a right little spreadsheet on this one. It's funny.
Yeah.
I still haven't got it 100% right tonight. Now, it's... Hare basically got away with it because he shipped basically Burke. So although they were friends, they weren't that good of friends because they screwed each other over. So Hare, as soon as the trial was over and he was released, he basically headed for England, and no one kind of really definitely knows what happened to Hare. But Burke, we definitely know, was hanged at Lawn Market, actually. And actually, there was 25,000 people in attendance.
Yeah. I think hanging obviously was rife then, and they used to do that in the town centres and stuff.
Yeah, what we're doing today, we're going to see the hanging.
Yeah,
a public spectacle, I think the expression is. But also, I think this is like just desserts, really, because Burke's skeleton is actually still on display at Surgeons Hall in Edinburgh.
Yeah, that's right.
So his body was donated to science, which is kind of fitting, I feel.
Yeah. And didn't he have a death mask as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it said they've got a life mask of Hare's face, but I don't know how they got that.
Okay.
I'd not heard.
And what's the life mask?
I assume it's done when they're alive, whereas the other one's done when you're dead. That's all.
Okay.
I would assume.
Oh, okay.
I could be completely wrong on that. I don't know. I'd heard of death masks, but not life masks.
Yeah. No, I've not. I can't say I've heard of a life mask either, to be fair.
When we went to Hatfield, didn't we see a death mask of a king there?
Yes. I can't remember which king, but yes, I'm sure. I'm sure Richard in the chat room will be able to clarify that.
Possibly. Yeah, it probably will. He'll go, oh, it's Richard the First.
Yeah.
How weird.
Or second or
right.
third.
Yeah.
Or
Who knows? Maybe it's an Edward. It could be a William.
It's one of them.
Anyway,
it was a royal.
It was a royal. That's all about death masks anyway. That's like a completely different topic, actually. Death masks. That's a fascinating one. There's some amazing death masks around it. Anyway, I digress.
Yes.
As I say, Hare run away to England and kind of nobody really knows. There are rumours, but I think, again, folklore surrounds this one.
Yeah.
He was thrown in, one story says he was thrown into a lime quarry by an angry mob and ended up a blind beggar on the streets of London. But no one really knows. There's no... It's not like he had notoriety elsewhere. He sort of just like disappeared.
Yeah. It was probably the fella that started selling dead bodies to that bloke in London.
You never know, right?
Just carried on, yeah.
You never know. Or he turned into Sweeney Todd, and then that was a whole different story, right?
Oh, that's a good one. It was a singing I didn't like.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Love it. Anyway, it's my kind of thing. Now, what I think is worse about this, and I think this shows class division beautifully, is Knox, who was actually buying the bodies, actually creating the trade for this sort of thing, and proven that he was cleared of his involvement in the murders. So although he didn't commit the murder, he did kind of by proxy, because he was disposing of the bodies.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So I kind of... It's a difficult one, because you can see how the situation has arisen, as it were. Do you know what I mean? You can see how it's happened, but does that make him less guilty just because all he did was buy him and turn a blind eye?
Yeah, he didn't ask any questions where they came from, so he wouldn't have known about the murders.
And he did try to cover it up quite quickly when someone was saying they recognised the corpse. He was quick to kind of get rid of the bits that were identifiable, as it were.
I think it's although he might not have asked questions, I think it would have been a bit naive to believe that he didn't know anything about it.
Well, I think he was like, it was an educated guess, I would say.
Yeah.
I would say that would have been an educated guess. Now, he also ended up going to London to try to salvage his career, because it actually ruined him in Scotland. So he came to London to try and salvage his career in medicine. I don't know how he got on.
Yeah. He probably was the founder of the British Medical Board or something.
I don't know. It's all I can say on that one.
Only
we didn't look that far. We didn't look that far, to be fair. Now, basically, after the... Oh, sorry, excuse me. Sneezled.
Clear the screen off,
Yeah, sorry, I've got to just wipe my screen. I can't see it now. Now, in London, there were the London Burkers in Bethnal Green. There was murders, and the same kind of situation happened in London as well with these guys. And this actually led to the Anatomy Act in 1832, which then changed the law, which allowed doctors, lecturers and students greater access to dead bodies, basically cadavers, and basically what they would, for a donation, so you could donate your body to medical science. And then they still had the influx from people being hanged at this point. So, it increased their cadavers, so it reduced the need for body snatching. So it kind of effectively put an end to the body snatchers trade.
Yeah. Which then might also explain how Knox got away with it, basically. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that could explain it quite well, actually.
But again, it's like he didn't actually commit the murder. It's a difficult one, isn't it? I wonder how that would stand up in a court of law. Whether or not even now you would get away with it.
Obviously, he got away with it. That's how it stood up.
Well, this is true. But he also, don't forget, he was also, he's a doctor. He's sort of useful to society. He's well-to-do and got connections kind of thing as well. Yeah. So, those kind of people would have. So I don't know. I mean, you can look at it from different angles, can't you?
Yeah, definitely.
But I do think it's the same as like Dick Turpin. It's like Burke and Hare, this whole mythology and folklore have risen up surrounding them, and we have built them into characters that they probably, the reality was a lot more commonplace and seedy, quite frankly. It's almost like, Dick Turpin, we have visions of him riding heroically from London to York in a certain amount of hours, half killing his horse, and jumping the wall of York and all that. But the reality of it is not going to have been there. And actually, if you actually look at what he was supposed to have looked like to the media portrayal of him, it's a completely different ball game.
Yeah.
And I think this is the same with Burke and Hare. A lot of mythology and folklore are spread up and tales of what they're supposed to have done. And they probably didn't. They probably just did what the boarding house thing because it was easy.
Well, that's it. And it's because obviously they were getting money for the cadavers as well. It was just easy money. Okay, it started off possibly accidentally, but they thought, well, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
When people die, we can help them along, help them kick the bucket, and then we'll cash them in because we'll end up getting more money out of it. And it sort of, gets them more money, and the medical field advances.
Yeah.
So it's win-win.
There are tales and tales about various people, but they're all called like body snatchers or resurrectionists or the Burkers. The Burkers is a term that's used for body snatchers. So many tales abound about these kind of characters and the lengths that they would have gone to. And I don't believe this for a minute. The one set was supposed to have a coach that was draped in black with a zinc floor, but the floor had holes in it to allow the blood to flow out freely, where they'd murdered someone, shove them in the back, slit their throats, however they did it.
Yeah, again, that's a possible thing. It's not too hard to imagine. But then I suppose that if they've just murdered someone,
it's quite a big.
Yeah,
it's very theatrical, is what I would
say. It
is
absolutely.
That's why. That's why I kind of don't believe it, because it's almost too theatrical for the day. It's almost a very romanticised vision of what they were like. I mean,
I'm sure there was
one says that they used to muffle their.
Person there that done it.
Well, maybe, I don't know. I can't say yes or no on that one for sure, but to me, it just sounds like a good story. Another one says the horses' hooves were muffled. And they were dressed like undertakers. But then I suppose if you're frequenting graveyards, and it's quite a good cover, you're not going to get questioned if you're dressed up in that kind of regalia. But I don't.
Again, I don't believe that one either. I mean, you put a pair of Nikes on the horse, and then it's quite plausible that they were all dressed in undertaker's gear, obviously frequenting the graves, as you said, but no, not the horse, the horse's hooves with the rubber pads.
But then in those days, they made a bit of a racket on the old cobbles. So if you was trying to do something nefarious and do something quietly, then you would. You'd cloth them. Yeah,
but what's more suspicious? A horse walking through the streets normal,
but maybe it was common practice at night
with Nikes on.
Or maybe it was common practice at night for like taxis and Hansom cabs and stuff like that to keep the noise levels down in the cities and stuff like that.
Okay, I'll give you that, possibly.
I don't know. Historically, I don't know. But it we moan about traffic noise now. Maybe back then horses' hooves were an issue.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I don't know.
Just a little thought I had while we were just talking. But that's where your brain goes, right? So
yeah,
I don't know. I think it's very. I say again, it's one of these you can look at from so many different angles, like the law and sociology, the social setting and the culture and lifestyle and the social economics of it all. And I find it quite fascinating how things happen because of all different factors.
Yeah.
I do find it absolutely fascinating. Now, tinkers were a bit of an issue back then as well.
Apparently so.
There are stories of a lot of tinkers sort of like going missing. Thanks to the body snatchers, these were the ones they tended to like pick on if they wanted to have a fresh one. So there are lots of stories surrounding that. But I have to say, one of the things you found out, which I didn't. Again, this is a whole new topic to me, really, considering I thought I knew it and I didn't. And it's one of those. You found a diary, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. There was a resurrectionist called Joseph Naples. He was one of the rare body snatchers to keep a diary of his work, and they actually quoted a couple of days that he wrote in his journal. I mean, they're not too long; they're only a few lines each. And one was the 13th of January, 1812. He said, "Took two of the above to Mr. Brooks, one large and one small to Mr. Bell, a fetus to Carpew, small to Mr. Frampton, large to Mr. Klein. Met at 5. The party went to Newington. 2 adults took them to St. Thomas's." So it almost sounds like he was a cab driver, and he was dropping off these bodies. And then he picked up 2 adults, took them to Newington, and then. But no, I think obviously they're obviously cadavers, and he was just dropping them off. And then the 26th of August, 1812, pretty much totally normal. This one, separated to look out. The party met at night. Wilson, M, and F. Bartholomew. Jack and Hollis went to Islington. Could not succeed. The dogs flew at us. Afterwards, went to St. Pancras. Found a watch planted. Found a watch planted. And came home. So again, I think that was pretty much he was trying to go out grave robbing, and he was scared off by the dogs.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, so there you go. That was like a diary snippet of
his
two days.
Was that the only surviving snippet, or was there?
Yeah,
no,
that was it. That's all that was on the information that I found. I didn't really look up him any more than just that, but just that is just an insight into what it was in the day. So on 13th of January, he had like his shopping list. One large and one small to Mr. Bell. So I assume that's an adult and a child. And then
because you'd also have a lot of like kids that were just like roaming, wouldn't you? You'd have a lot of street urchins, were they called back in the day?
Yeah, that's it. 2
Fagin,
adult.
I'm thinking Fagin here in my head.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the same era, to be fair.
Probably not, but that's the image I've got in my head.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have thought it'd be too far off of that, to be fair. Yeah. And then obviously he went off to a party. A cadaver party. Maybe it was a party where all these body snatchers got together and they swapped cadavers.
Wow, my surgeon needs a big one.
Yeah,
my one's on little ones over here. Oh my god.
So cabbages and threw all their keys in the bowl.
Now we're going down a whole different ball game. Like, Paul, just so I've had enough of that kind of talk today, thanks.
Well, you never know. Absolutely.
Oh, we went down a whole different weird angle there. All I can say is this is fascinating. I knew the story of Burke and Hare, and I kind of like thought, I didn't realise it was a lodging house scenario. I thought they sort of were like, literally, like I said at the beginning of the show, like they just would like go out and dig up corpses and just sell them on. I just didn't think they did the murdering bit.
I must admit, I didn't expect that one. Like you, I just expected it to be body snatching because that's what they're known for. And it was quite fascinating that they had their boarding house, lodging house, whatever it was. And I mean, obviously I knew that they'd sell the bodies for medical science.
Yeah,
But,
that
yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
was it.
Yeah.
That kind of was it.
Definitely.
But it just goes to show, doesn't it? But again, like I will say again, it wasn't just in Edinburgh. It was all over. You know, there were a major town or city that's got anything medical, you know, linked to it. This would have been a thing. It was a really big worry at the time for people to go to the measures of like guarding the graveyards and, you know, having these mort safes and having dogs there and watchtowers and, you know, I mean, God, that's quite a thing, really.
It is, and I've never seen a cemetery with a watchtower. I'd love to know if there is. Yeah,
they probably would have been wooden, so there'd be no evidence of it, I would say. But that would be interesting to dig into deeper. Actually, it would be to see if there were any records of it.
The one that I saw on the website when I was doing the research, one of the websites had a picture of it was a stone. It was a stone tower, and the stairs were going around the outside of it all the way up, which is quite interesting. I'll have to go and have another look at that, see whether or not it did state where it was, because I'd love to go down and have a look.
Well, and also, how common was a watchtower? Or is that just like the odd big kind of like some, I don't know. Anyway, we could spend all night musing on the questions this throws up.
Yeah, I would have thought it'd be like the major towns like Edinburgh, maybe a few London. I mean, maybe even Highgate might have had one.
I was just thinking that when we were talking, actually. I wonder. Be interesting to find out.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're coming to the end of the show, babes.
We are, absolutely. So, what have we got coming up for the future? Few weeks, whatever.
Well, for this week, let's get this week out of the way first.
Okay.
And then we'll go on to what we're doing for the next few weeks. Right. So tomorrow night on Haunted Histories, Penny has got the lovely Gina Pisani from Three Girls in the Dark on the show, possibly a special guest too. You'll have to wait and see on that one. Talking all about Octagon Hall, and not a location I know about, to be fair. So I'm looking forward to that one.
I've heard of that one. I don't know nothing about that, so yeah, I'll listen on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a place you don't know. I like finding out about places I don't know as well as places I do know. And then on Thursday evening on PSH Radio, Carl and Sam have got the lovely Rob Guttro back in the studio talking from the angle about pets and the afterlife.
Cool.
Which is always an interesting one. It's always an interesting concept when people bring it up. So, and how a psychic connects to that as well. I always find that a bit fascinating. I don't understand my dog, and I reckon I've got some sort of skill. Do you know what I mean? But my dog just stares at me. I'm sure all he says is food. It probably is, to be fair. Then on the Dark Mirror Show on Friday evening, we are allowing Mark to indulge his inner Anunnaki. He throws it out on just about every show possible, or gets the Anunnaki link in there. So we're actually going to actually have a look at it. We should have done it a few weeks back, but we've done it. Paul?
Okay. Cool.
What are we doing next week?
Oh, next week we've got a good one. We are going to carry on with this Missing Bodies trilogy with the last of our shows on the subject. We're going to be talking about the Missing 411. And it was a case that Mark brought to the table. Mm-hmm. So I did actually invite Mark to the show because he brought it to the table, so I thought it was only fair. So hopefully Mark will join us next week. And we're going to be talking about, as I said, this Missing 411. Basically, there's over 12,000 cases of hunters going missing in national parks across America. And the cases that we're going to be looking at are some of the more mysterious ones, where hunters, because obviously they're quite well trained, they've grown up hunting, and then all of a sudden they just go missing. No trace of them are found. There are a couple that's found in mysterious circumstances, but it's a really big issue in America, and that's what we're going to be looking at, the missing 411.
Cool. I hope it's as interesting as the Dyatlov Pass. It sounds very similar in certain ways.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a documentary, and I believe it's on Amazon. So if anyone's on Amazon, definitely get to see this documentary. I think it's called Missing 411 The Hunted. Is the name of the documentary. So if you can get to see that before next week's show, fantastic. And we'll be just talking about that.
Cool.
Yeah. So, Kerry, you've got to watch that now.
Oh, I'm gonna have to, aren't I? now you've done the big build up on it, you know.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really fascinating subject. I watched that documentary and I was like, wow, at the end of it.
It's an interesting one from what I've looked at so far on this one.
It
you
is.
Told me about it. I was like, oh, never heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the hunters go missing, and where like they have like search patterns and stuff, and they go and search it and there's nothing, and then the week later they search it again and they find something, and it's like you couldn't have missed that the first time.
Yeah,
it's so but yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, we'll go into more details next week anyway.
Yeah, no worries, because otherwise we might as well just carry on and do the show now.
Extend it for another hour.
Extend it, why not? Why not? Anyway.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us in the chat room. It's been an absolute pleasure. Love the interaction in the chat room. Not that there wasn't too much tonight, but yeah, never mind. Next week we'll have more interaction going. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So thank you, Kerry, as well, for joining me.
Always
and
welcome.
It's a good night from me.
And it's a good night from me.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.